Where are my 40 acres and a mule? Reparations for black people. The proposal of 40 acres and a mule is a historical event that is often referenced when discussing the concept of reparations for the African American community. The concept originated during the Civil War in 1865, as an attempt to solve the issue of what would become of millions of freed slaves who were displaced and had no means to sustain themselves. General William T. Sherman, Union Army, issued Special Field Orders No. 15 on January 16, 1865. It proposed the redistribution of confiscated Southern lands to the newly freed slaves. Main provisions of Special Field Orders No. 15. The allocation of land along the Atlantic coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. The land was to be divided into parcels of not more than 40 acres per eligible freed slave. The Army was authorized to loan mules to the settlers for their farming operations. More than 40,000 freed slaves were settled on 400,000 acres in Georgia and South Carolina under this order. Following the assassination of President Lincoln, his successor, President Andrew Johnson, rescinded the order in the fall of 1865. The land was returned to its previous white owners. As a result, most freed slaves remained impoverished and had to turn to sharecropping, a system that perpetuated economic inequality. Legacy of the 40 acres and a mule promise. The unfulfilled promise of 40 acres and a mule is still relevant today, as it laid the foundation for the modern discussion about reparations. Legislation attempts. Over the years, various legislative attempts have been made to address the issue of reparations. The most notable is H.R. 40, a bill introduced in Congress in 1989, and reintroduced several times since then, that calls for a study of slavery's impact and the feasibility of reparations. As of the creation of this video tutorial, this bill has not passed. 1. Role of federal and state governments in supporting slavery. Enabling laws and policies. Constitutional clauses. Several clauses in the U. Constitution implicitly recognized and protected slavery without naming it. The 3/5 Clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and the clause protecting the importation of enslaved people are examples. Judicial endorsements. Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott v. Sandford case in 1857 ruled that slaves were property and not citizens, thereby asserting the rights of slave owners at a federal level. 2. Discrimination against freed slaves and their descendants. Black codes and Jim Crow laws. After the Civil War, Southern states enacted black codes, which restricted the freedom of African Americans and ensured their availability as a cheap labor force. These evolved into Jim Crow laws, which mandated racial segregation in all public facilities. Voting restrictions. Measures such as literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses were used to suppress African American suffrage. Housing and education segregation. Housing policies like redlining and separate but unequal education enforced segregation and restricted access to opportunities for African Americans. Private sector discrimination. Employment discrimination. African Americans have historically been, and continue to be, discriminated against in hiring, promotion, and wages. Housing discrimination. Practices like restrictive covenants, steering, and discriminatory mortgage lending practices have limited where African Americans can live and accumulate wealth. 3. Lingering negative effects of slavery on living African Americans in society. Economic disparities. The wealth gap. Presently, the median wealth of U.S. black households is about $25,100, compared to $189,100 for white households. Racial discrimination and prejudice. The societal stereotype of black inferiority, rooted in slavery, fuels ongoing racial discrimination and prejudice. Incarceration rates. Racial disparities in the criminal justice system can be traced back to discriminatory laws and practices that targeted African Americans after the abolition of slavery. Educational inequities. School segregation, although legally ended, persists in practice. This has led to ongoing disparities in the quality of education received by African American students. Centuries of racial discrimination, rooted in the institution of slavery, have contributed to persistent health disparities between Black and white Americans. Social attitudes and racial tensions. Incidents of racial profiling, police violence against African Americans, and hate crimes are manifestations of these deeply rooted prejudices. The Black Lives Matter movement and protests against racial injustice reflect the ongoing struggle for racial equality that originated in the era of slavery. The broken promise of 40 acres and a mule continues to be a powerful symbol in discussions of racial justice in the United States. And hopefully one day both you and I will be able to inherit our forefathers' reparations as a form of payment for their over 300 years of work for no wages.